Great pleasure and always a delight to have Carolyn Burke here with us. She is no stranger to City Lights. She produced this wonderful book on Lee Miller many years ago. We're really happy to host her back then, and equally happy to host her for Foursome. Alfred Stieglitz, Georgia O'Keeffe, Paul Strand, and Rebecca Salisbury. It is published by the Venerable Alfred Knopf and captures the kind of nuances of a friendship between these four really seminal figures in 20th century art, but also the influences upon each other's lives. But you know, it's also really about a time that is gone. And Carolyn just has a way of really capturing it so beautifully, and the layering of it, and not dumbing it down. And she kind of knows what to look for, and she has this kind of magnetic ability to kind of like find the right information. She is the author of No Regrets, The Life of Edith Piaf, as I mentioned, the Lee Miller book, and also Becoming Modern, The Life of Nina Loy. As we were talking earlier, she's born in Sydney, Australia. She now lives in Santa Cruz. Very delighted to have her with us. And joining her, no stranger to City Lights, Oscar Villalon, who is the managing editor of ZYZZYVA magazine, as many of you know. He's the former book editor at the San Francisco Chronicle and board member of the National Book Critics Circle. His reviews have appeared in NPR.org and KQED's The California Report. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thank everybody for coming. Before we begin, Carolyn will read from the book, and then after she reads, we'll dive into the conversation. Before you do, I just want to say really quickly, it's an incredibly rich book, so I just want to manage your expectations right now. We're not going to get into everything. There's a lot there. But we'll do our best to cover as many things we think you'll find of interest. Okay.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Oscar. Can you hear me?
Yes.
What I would like you to do is cast your minds back almost a century. It might take a bit of imagination, but actually, I don't think it's going to be hard at all. We're going to start off in New York City in 1921, January. Alfred Stieglitz's opening, his long-awaited opening, showing his new photography. Everyone thought that he had given up taking photographs when he became so discouraged towards the end of World War I, not knowing that it was ending, of course. He did very little until 4 years later. So this is the event at which he returned to public life and indeed to public notoriety. This section is called Opening. Alfred Stieglitz often said that taking photographs was like making love. The crowds that flocked to the Anderson galleries to see his work in the winter of 1921 could not fail to note the entwining of creative zest and sexual desire in his portraits of an unidentified woman, in quotation marks. This study of his model, dressed and undressed, made up a third of the long-awaited exhibition. Within days, it became the most controversial artistic event of the year. Never was there such a hubbub about a one-man show, a sympathizer recalled. In the aftermath of the recent Red Scare and Harding's election to the presidency, Stieglitz's prints looked like an affront to society. To some critics, they were all but un-American, the artist's way of flouting Harding's plan to bring back pre-war standards. The country's greatest need, Harding had repeated during his campaign, was, quote, not nostrums but normalcy, not revolution but restoration. In the current political climate, the photographer's assertion of his right to display life uncensored was an act of defiance. Stieglitz has not divorced his art from life, a critic wrote. If one were to find fault with his show, it would be with its, quote, lack of reticence. Stieglitz, he concluded, keeps nothing back. It's February. On opening day, February 7th, after bracing the icy winds blowing down Park Avenue, Manhattan's cognoscenti gathered beneath the skylights on the 4th floor of a neoclassical building on the corner of Park Avenue and 59th Street. Contemporary reports describe them standing as still as if they were in church. After the closing 4 years earlier of 291, Stieglitz's gallery, where New Yorkers first saw the most provocative modern artists, some thought that he had given up photography and his role as a guiding force in American culture. Recently, word had gotten round that he had been reinvigorated by his love for the artist Georgia O'Keeffe, that his photographs of her, identified only as a woman, were sensational. His resurrection, another critic announced, is a staggering phenomenon, and in its éclat, dazzling. Visitors entered the first room with a sense of anticipation. The photographer's warm-toned blacks and whites glowed so intensely against the red plush walls that some wanted to touch them. Stieglitz was holding forth in a corner, telling spellbound listeners about his struggle to win acceptance of photography as an affirmation of life. Gazing at his Prince of Manhattan, Fifth Avenue swirling with snow, cab drivers watering their horses, Central Park on an icy night, people marveled at his way of letting life be life, as he was heard to say. Others were drawn to his scenes of modernity, backyards strung with clotheslines, half-finished construction sites, railroad yards in the snow. His recent work went beyond what was called art photography, eschewing the pictorialist techniques then in vogue to reveal the subject itself. "They make me want to forget all the photographs I had ever seen before," a critic declared. Moving into the next room, which was filled with portraits, visitors lingered over those recalling the great days of 291. That's his gallery. Members of the Stieglitz group studied his prints of their circle, the artists John Marin, Marsden Hartley, and Charles Duncan, the critics Leo Stein, Paul Rosenfeld, and the West Indian writer Hodge Kiernan, who had run the elevator at 291. Stieglitz's surrogate son, the photographer Paul Strand, stared back at those who stepped in front of his likeness on their way to the pictures of the notorious woman. They encountered her in a grouping that showed her before one of her charcoal drawings. Dressed in a trim black jacket and hat, she looked away from the camera, a portrait of the artist as a young woman. Moving around the room, visitors met her in more intimate poses, her hat off, her tailored blouse unbuttoned, her dark tresses undone. In a warm palladium print, she reappeared in a white kimono, whose delicate pattern complemented the dark tones of her hair. Studies of her elegant hands and fingers were grouped in a single portrait, as if these parts expressed the woman as a lover and an artist. On another wall, her hands touched her voluptuous breasts, weighing their contours or pressing them together, in a group labeled forthrightly, hands and breasts. Some of these are in this chapter. Another set of sepia-tone prints, torsos, compared her body to sculpture, while simultaneously drawing the gaze to the dark V shape of her pubic hair. Photographs marked by such intimacy had never been seen in public. They seemed to tell a story tracing the growth of the couple's affections. Stieglitz's portrait of this woman, one admirer wrote, quote, "showed us the life of the pores, of the hairs along the shin bone, of the veining of the pulse, and the liquid moisture on the upper lip." To some, these prints were love poems. Stirred by what they saw, visitors returned again and again. Men asked Stieglitz if he would take portraits of their wives and sweethearts. But some found the photographs obscene. The group called Hands and Breasts offended one man who ranted at the gallery's director that such photographs did not qualify as art and should be taken down. The review in the New York Times was laced with innuendos. In these, quote, psychological revelations, it proclaimed, a good deal of the primitive was getting the upper hand. Those who feared what might be found in their psyches were warned to keep away from Stieglitz. Other critics were more forthright. The spirit of sex permeates the entire body of photographs. For the rest of the month, while critics debated the merits of Stieglitz's prints and argued about photography's status as art, the public flocked to the show. Even those who had not been in the know now understood that the subject of his composite portrait was the young art teacher whose affair with the photographer had led to his leaving his wife. Reactions to this record of his feelings for his mistress varied from outrage on the part of some, including photographers for whom such frank treatment of the female body was unthinkable, to the awed response of a young woman who left the gallery in tears. "He loves her so," she said as she went out the door. Searching for more measured ways to express themselves, some compared the portraits to old master drawings. Stieglitz's pictures of O'Keeffe were painterly, the critic Henry McBride observed. They put him in mind of canvases by Courbet or Rossetti. "He spends an immense amount of time making love to the subject before taking it," McBride added. But he referred to O'Keeffe not as an artist, but as Stieglitz's muse. Mona Lisa got one portrait of herself worth looking at. O'Keeffe got 100. The gallery became a place to see and be seen. People returned in increasing numbers. The bolder among them joined the group in the corner where most afternoons Stieglitz held forth, explaining his desire to embody, quote, universality in the shape of a woman. He talked almost non-stop, gesticulating and shaking his thick white hair to emphasize his belief that it was in the new world that a truly modern art like photography had found its home. Moreover, he believed that in his, quote, demonstration of portraiture, there was an interrelation of the parts to the whole and a symbolism of all life. Those who wondered what was being symbolized may have found some satisfaction in a review in The Nation by Herbert Seligman, one of the Stieglitz clan. Stieglitz had, quote, laid bare the raw material which America has not dared to look upon, Seligman wrote. Love of the world leads him to the purest expression of it, to woman. Seen this way, his portrait of this woman evoked an innocence and receptivity, Seligman claimed, that have no home in an America whose genteel standards kept it from embracing the truths of the body. Paul Strand took up the defense in terms that gallery goers were more likely to grasp, by praising Stieglitz's use of the camera. His essay, Alfred Stieglitz and a Machine, began circulating among New Yorkers keen to understand what the photographer was up to. His work was life-affirming, Strand wrote. Quote, Stieglitz accepted the machine, instinctively found in it something that was part of himself, and loved it. It was also groundbreaking. Quote, these amazing portraits, whether they objectify faces or hands, the torso of a woman or the torso of a tree, suggest the beginning of a penetration of the scientific spirit into plastic media. Strand could also be heard arguing that he and his mentor were cultural workers, that their works offered a mean to identify, quote, those hostile impulses of society which try to prevent every extension of the human spirit. Understood this way, the camera was an expression of, quote, young desire, facing a world and social system which fears and thwarts and destroys. These were fiery words, out of keeping with Strand's habitual reserve, but they appealed to Rebecca Salisbury, a vivacious young woman who accompanied him to the gallery to meet his mentor. In the throes of her own struggles with the social systems and her mother's opposition to the desires of strong-minded women like herself, Rebecca experienced their meeting as a turning point. She listened to Stieglitz talk non-stop until closing time. Then, as they strolled along 59th Street to Columbus Circle, and for the rest of the evening at his favorite Chinese restaurant. What Stieglitz and his work revealed to her, she believed, was, quote, affirmation, life kindled. Seeking to recreate herself as a modern woman, Rebecca would often compare herself to Georgia, as Paul compared himself to Alfred. He had just begun an extended portrait of Rebecca as his muse. But this sequence, which he never found satisfactory, was as much an homage to Alfred and to his relations with Georgia as a tribute to the woman who had just come into his life. the two couples would become a tightly integrated foursome, with admiration, competitiveness, in-jokes, and alliances passing in every possible direction among them. At this stage, Stieglitz held uncontested sway over his protégés. He molded those who, like Rebecca Salisbury, were awestruck in his presence. Yet it was also true that intimates experienced his wrath if they crossed him. Years later, O'Keeffe recalled, there was a constant grinding like the ocean. It was as if something hot, dark, and destructive was hitched to the highest, brightest star. In the interweaving of these two couples' lives and works, extremes coexisted. Constellations on the horizon of homegrown modern art, they prodded, inspired, irritated, and encouraged one another as they grew into modes of relationship that none could have foreseen. Their foursome became more entangled once Alfred began taking photographs of Rebecca, often nude, in an implicit rivalry with Paul, his disciple, and when Georgia told Rebecca that she and Paul had once been so close that they discussed living together. Without Rebecca's encouragement, Georgia would probably not have discovered New Mexico as her chosen terrain, nor would Paul and Rebecca have ended their marriage when he set out to attempt a more politically conscious photography in Mexico. And without Georgia as her model and surrogate sister, Rebecca would not have found her way to her own practice of art in the Southwest, the region that became, for both women, the antidote to Stieglitz's New York. I have one more paragraph. The idea for this book first took shape as I read through Rebecca's letters, in which the person she became under Stieglitz's tutelage sought to understand her role in the shaping of their foursome. Amplified by the correspondence in their archives, this narrative traces the relations of these four strong-willed people over several decades, in the hope of depicting the sometimes joyful, sometimes exasperated intermingling of their lives as artists, lovers, and friends. In the process of writing this book, I came to believe that my four characters searched to conciliate the often contradictory pulls of personal and artistic life still speaks to us a century later. Their story could not have been told from this vantage point without the collaboration that first made it possible with the artist Lance Sprague, who can't be here tonight. While I was writing about them, our discussions and discoveries nourished the process in ways that might have amused the four could they have watched us reweaving the complex mesh of their lives. Thank you.
Thank you for that reading. That was so appropriate, I think, for the book to begin that way. It becomes that section is an overture of sorts that lets us know some of the themes are going to be addressed and sets the table for what's to come. And what's to come, essentially, is it's a group biography in which the four people are given equal attention by you. And over the course of decades, all the way to their death, the death of each of them, we witness relationships that are both loving and cruel, that are rewarding and desolating, that are also exasperating,
yes,
and nurturing. And what makes the book so particularly powerful is that we have their words, their own words, documenting their relationships over these years, sometimes doing so in unguarded ways, other times quite calculating in terms of what they tell each other about what they're thinking and what they're feeling. And even though it is, again, you give equal weight to all four, I think I wanted to begin by first talking about Alfred Stieglitz. He's the reason why there's even a foursome. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about his life leading up to that moment in 1921. That's to say, could you talk more about why he was viewed as someone would later say in the biography, or a god. Why he was, what was it about him, his views of what he would call American art, his particular views of that? He's always talking about artists being able to see things.
He had, if this isn't a sort of a tautology, a visionary sense of seeing and the role of photography. In a certain way, his ideas about photography in particular, modern art in general, had a strong kind of messianic quality to them. He firmly believed and managed to persuade his members of his circle, or to find people who thought in the same way, that the problems with American society and culture could be remedied if people could learn to see, and that photography would somehow teach them to see all kinds of things that they had not managed to pay attention to or had been told not to pay attention to before. And that this would be not only liberating, but spiritually uplifting. So it's a very exalted notion of what art can do. He also had the sense that, as Paul Strand said, that people working in these fields, painting, photography, cultural criticism and so on, were workers. They were down there in the trenches, as it were, laboring to reform the somewhat benighted state of American culture as he saw it in those years. Remember, this is just after World War I, when there's a real backlash and a return to a kind of not very reflective America First position. So he was very much aware of some of the dangers inherent in this situation, and thought that through artistic exhibitions, movements, provocative statements, he could somehow jolt America into a more sensitive and receptive way of looking at life.
And he was also talking about how he didn't want artists looking towards Europe for their cues in America. He believed that basically, and this is to my reading of it, that everything we need to create art on equal to whatever's being done in Paris could be done here.
That's right. Before the war, he was very well known for having brought the most radical experiments of European modern art to New York, which the paintings and the sculpture and other works of art that were shown at 291. Well, through the complicated disillusionment and even, I could say, despair that took hold of him and members of his circle in the wartime, when everyone wanted to turn their backs on the European conflict and on European sources, he came around to this idea that you just articulated, Oscar, that a truly American modern art needed to find its source material in the country, in the native colors, shapes, forms, motifs. And so while many artists and intellectuals and writers were, of course, going to Europe in the 1920s, as we know, he and his group of friends were resolutely stay-at-home sorts, and even criticized those who went off and hung out in Paris as taking the easy way out.
So he becomes this light, this incredibly charismatic figure who attracts all these people to him. And of course, among those people are going to be O'Keeffe and Strand and Salisbury. And before I get to O'Keeffe, who's really the other titan of art, I think, within this group, and arguably Strand is too, I wanted to talk about Strand and Salisbury. Leading up to 1921, how does Strand come to know Stieglitz? How does he end up falling into his good graces?
That's very interesting. Strand went to school at the Ethical Culture School, which was, some of you may know, it was quite a progressive school and sort of nursery school for would-be artists. He had the great good fortune as a young man, maybe 16, 17, something, to take a class in photography, which wasn't even a formal class. It was sort of an after-school hobby class. with none less than Lewis Hines, who happened to be teaching at the Ethical Culture School. Well, Lewis Hines, of course, was a friend of Stieglitz's. So one day he took this small group of would-be photographers, including Strand, down to 291 to have a look at what was on the walls. And as Strand relates this moment, he was struck dumb and knew instantly that that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to be a photographer. So you see, exhibitions are important. It took a few years until Strand could acquire the resources, the means, the camera, access to darkroom and so on. But he joined the New York Camera Club and went back to 291 again and again, finally plucked up his courage to show Stieglitz his own work in 1915. By then he was so proficient that Stieglitz recognized in him the kind of artist he wanted to encourage and practically adopted him as his surrogate son. And he said, "You're welcome to join us anytime. You are one of us. Please come whenever you wish." So that was an amazing invitation into a charmed circle.
So Stieglitz is born right around the American Civil War.
Yeah.
So he's, how old is he now at this point?
74, 84, 94. He'd be in his late 40s.
And Strand is much younger.
Yes, at least 20 years young. Stieglitz was more than a generation, or a good generation older than the other three, whom he called the children.
And then, and for good reason. And then Salisbury comes into their orbit through Strand. Is that correct?
That's right.
Could you talk about her? Her background is fascinating.
It is to me particularly. I'm so grateful to her for having come into my life, because she's the one who kind of lured me into this subject. She too went to ethical culture. We could say more about that. These very interesting kind of middle-class Jewish families who preferred to follow a more sort of rational version of Judaism, which often resulted in their taking progressive stances. She was, however, a few years younger than Strand and was very talented, both as a writer, as a painter, and a caricaturist. By the time she was in her early 20s, she and her brother had published a book of songs. She had also done illustrations for a kind of an anti-war book, trying to tell the lessons of why we must never go back to war. In other words, she was quite gifted, but didn't quite know what to do with herself. Had a very kind of late Victorian upbringing with a mother who is another story, who did not wish her to practice any kind of art form, and whose own views were so restrictive, according to Rebecca, that she couldn't find any way to break from her mother and run off and earn her own keep. Which was, there are many reasons for that. Well, fortunately for Rebecca and Paul, they met at an art collector's party, at the best I can reconstruct the story. And Paul was quite struck with her. There are letters in which he writes to Stieglitz about this very attractive young woman with opinions of her own, whom he has just met. This is about 1920. Now, what became apparent in their circle was that she also looked a good deal like Georgia. There was a strong similarity, and since Paul had already had a very big crush on Georgia and considered living with her, though this was an interesting angle. However, Rebecca didn't know this, and within a short time they were very, very close and married, about a year and a half later, by which time Paul had already begun his composite photo, extensive photo portrait of Rebecca, almost entirely inspired by Alfred's of Georgia.
So, leading up to this 1921 show, when O'Keeffe is the model, there's a beginning to that. As to say, O'Keeffe first meets Stieglitz, and then she meets him, I think, in New York. Is that correct? When she's studying art.
That's right. she too went to his studio. If you were an art student of any kind, you'd go to 291 to see what was on the walls there.
So Matisse would be on the walls, these sort of things.
Rodin.
And then she has to leave because she's in New York to get a teaching credential at Columbia's Teachers College. So she gets a job in Canyon, Texas. And this is actually where their relationship begins. It's a long-distance relationship through letters.
Yes, although they had met briefly before that. But those letters, thank goodness we have them, are some of the most beautiful letters I've ever read. Love letters of such passionate depth and seeing, because they're always describing to each other what they're looking at. She describes all the colors in this canyon, which is a small version of the Grand Canyon, I take it. And the letters go back and forth to them with such heat and expressions of desire that you know something's going to come of it. Although she didn't, because she was already in her late 20s and about 30, and she was a small town art teacher.
And she was afraid that this was going to be her fate, that this is how things would end. One of the things I found so lovely about the book is how, because of O'Keeffe's letters, we are shown a part of youth that we often forget. We see someone who's trying to find out what she wants and who she wants. That the world is wide open to her. That she feels the need to try to chase all the leads, if you will. But yet, but the interesting thing is that, so we see her at this point, like you said, she's in her late 20s, and then by the end of the book, we're going to see someone who has an unshakable sense of who she is and what she wants. Could you talk about that a little?
How she comes to this sense?
Yes. I mean, that's an overview, so to speak, of that, because that's a big chunk of the book, is guess what it boils down to.
Well, I'm glad that you said what you just said, Oscar, about our seeing her when she's young and seeing the other two when they're young, although Strand is more enigmatic. Seeing them before they become the people they will be. They're so much like ourselves, if I may say so. They're unsure which way to go. They're uncertain about the appropriateness of their own endeavors. And to see Georgia O'Keeffe that way is very moving. There's a real softness in her. At the same time, there's a growing conviction about going her own way in art, often in opposition to the men. She was soon taken up by the critics as the one-woman modern artist who was naturally, according to these critics, expressing the truth of a woman's body. Well, in a certain way, she did feel that she was painting at a woman, but she didn't want these male critics to put it that way. She didn't want to be put into that particular box. We can say more about that later. I think it was in reaction, in part, to the ways in which the New York critics in the 1920s took up that rhetoric about woman's art and painting from the body as if somehow you had no mind of your own and no technical skills, both of which she had, in spades, that helped her to become determined to insist on doing things her own way and to, if necessary, isolate herself, leave New York from time to time, turn her back on the local critics and the dominant rhetoric. Although I must say she profited tremendously from her relationship with Stieglitz and his sponsorship of her.
But it is such a complex is the understatement for that relationship. When I said before that it's often exasperating, there's one person who's very exasperating. One of the things I found so funny about when reading the book is that at this point, Stieglitz, when he's with O'Keeffe, when she comes back to New York and she's modeling for him, he's 52 or thereabouts. Yeah, so he's about 24 years older than her, or something like this. He's married, and at first you could kind of see the sort of attraction. He has a youthfulness. He has this wide open look of life. He seems to just full of life. I found it so fascinating that over the course of the book, then to see a young Strand, a young Salisbury, a young O'Keeffe, all mature, and Stieglitz plateaus.
That's absolutely right. It has a lot to do with his being of the previous generation, but also to do with his obstinacy and his conviction that he was indeed the one who knew and the one who could tell others what was right, what was wrong, how to see, sometimes he was exceedingly cruel and would say to a would-be acolyte or a friend like Rebecca at one point when he was angry with her, "You have lots of talents, but you simply don't see." He could be very destructive, which is why I quote that passage that I almost end the opening chapter with about O'Keeffe saying that there was something dark and grinding and destructive hitched to the highest, brightest star. There were great contradictions in the man, and you're right to point out that he plateaued. I think myself, it's when he starts taking those photographs of clouds. Maybe some of you know the Cloud series. He turned away from more familiar subjects, people, even architecture, the landscape, because he felt that in the clouds he had a sort of equivalent, a corresponding vision that allowed him to express his own emotions. I feel that he turned away and turned inward at that time, and perhaps took his own visions for, the gospel in a way.
One gets the sense reading the book that when he has moments of, shall we say, lucidity, by which I mean when he's not being jaw-droppingly selfish, he can see things that no one else can see.
Yeah.
And that he could be an incredible patron and mentor to these people. But and this is all through the book, as we see for all these various encounters and situations, his selfishness really dictates him. He really needs to satiate himself in every way, whether it be praise or sexually, whatever it might be. He feels no need to deny himself. And the interesting thing I found about it is that, for the most part, his protégés don't mirror that. That's to say, they seem to be more aware of a world beyond their circle.
I have to think about that a moment. In time, O'Keeffe became as fierce and as steadfast in her own vision and insistence on living as she felt she needed to live to keep on painting after she settled permanently in New Mexico. And I think while she was not her selfishness, her knowledge of herself has something of Stieglitz's steadfastness of purpose, but not to the same remarkable degree that you just described so well. I'm working with these people, living with them in my imagination for so long. I sometimes thought, really they're monsters of selfishness. I need to hang out with some people who are a little less self-absorbed. So, in a certain way, it may be inevitable. Not that you have to take it to the extent that Stieglitz did. That an artist who is really committed to his or her art at a time of difficulty and opposition will have to be, to some extent, very self-absorbed.
Yes, I think so. But I would argue that in the case of Stieglitz, it's that he needs them. In other words, they're all jealous of their time, but he's not considerate at all of the time of the other ones. He needs them to be mused. He needs them to nurture them. And before I go, I just want to bring up one thing too. I want to get back to Salisbury because arguably, I think, again, Paul Strand, O'Keeffe, and Stieglitz are giants for their arts and their fields. And then we have Rebecca Salisbury. And I found this very intriguing because rarely are we able to read these sort of biographies and identify with someone. That's to say, someone who's trying to figure out what to do with her life, who really wants to live in a certain way, and is trying to reckon with what she perceives to be her limitations. And at one point, she writes to Strand. She says about their foursome, "I am the only one who seems to create nothing. I am always conscious of it and regret it. The only real thing I can do is my relationship with you, yet she will evolve into an artist."
Yes, and that was, she's the one I identified with, naturally. And it was so interesting to see what it took for her to find her way. By the way, since she's not at all well known, I'll say that she did, in time, master an unusual form of painting, which is reverse oil on glass. It's very difficult, it's very challenging. I've looked into it and spoken with people who have tried it. But I think she was very clever in choosing that form. First of all, Georgia didn't do that, which helped. A few of her modernist colleagues, Marsden Hartley and one or two others did, but gave it up as too difficult. So she didn't have any competition. It could be her own thing. That's one aspect. She found her own thing. And then Paul was very encouraging. In fact, he was kindest to her, if one judges by the letters, when she was working steadily and producing the greatest number of pieces that he thought were worthy. So she was winning her husband's admiration by finding and practicing an art form that he could approve of. And in time, Stieglitz gave them a joint show, although that didn't go so well either. But I very much liked finding out, through Rebecca's view of the other three, how it was that she could find her own way and what she thought of their influence in her life.
Before I open up to questions, I want to ask you one more thing. You touched on this in the passage that you read. You provide a sense of all the tumult going on in society over the years of these relationships, and the question keeps coming up over and over again. And Stieglitz, almost directly talks about this in terms of what is art look like in these horrible times. That's to say, how should it be engaged? And if it's engaged, should it be obviously political? Or is there something else that the artist should be doing to situate their work in the present environment? I was wondering if you could talk a little about that, because as it'll turn out, it'll be Paul Strand who really believes, as quoting Stalin, that the job for artists should be to be engineers of the soul.
Yes, and these questions are very much with us. Still, and probably will never be easily resolved. That's when the break came, when Strand decided he had had enough. He could no longer go along with the Stieglitz idea, and this is 1932, just after Stieglitz gave Paul and Rebecca a joint show at his then gallery, but did nothing for it. No brochure, no publicity, practically said, take care of it yourselves. And this angered Paul so much that at the end of the exhibition he went back and turned in his keys, which was like really walking out the door. But what had been going on already in his life was that he had spent quite a bit of time in Mexico, some with Rebecca, as well as New Mexico, and he had become aware of a different way of practicing art that was more engaged, deliberately engaged in popular culture with the life of ordinary people, and perhaps even with aims of making changes in political structures by showing what was going on. Remember, this is Mexico in the 1930s, a great period of, revolutionary art, and he'd met many of its practitioners. So this was a huge break with his mentor for 15 years, let's say, Stieglitz, who simply could not see that art might have political uses, who thought that that was a prostitution of the function, that Strand was losing his marbles. And increasingly, Strand would be influenced by and hang out with people on the left, progressive art groups, and within a few years, he went to Moscow and met the most advanced filmmakers, because I didn't mention Strand also earned part of his living as a cinematographer. So he made a number of very interesting films in the 30s. But I didn't quite come around to what you...
Well, just that, I guess that was it. Just how there was a schism among them in terms of what they should be doing.
Yes.
I think O'Keeffe even talks about, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, saying, well, I think the nature of my work in itself is a rebuke. That this is political because it exalts the human.
That's right. There's a wonderful, wonderful scene. I enjoyed writing it so much. In about 1932 again, there was a debate at the New School in Lower Manhattan with Georgia O'Keeffe and Mike Gold. Do some of you know who Mike Gold is? He was a writer who was very much on the left, very far to the left, wrote for the New Masses and other kinds of publications like that. And it was about the function of art. So it was in that context that O'Keeffe made this remark. He accused her of satisfying bourgeois standards by painting lilies and flowers, and said that this served no purpose. What you should be showing is the oppressed proletariat. Whereupon she made the remark that you just quoted, that she felt.
That's right. That this is I'm trying to depict humanity. I'm trying to depict those things which make us want to be alive. That in of itself is what I feel is more than a worthy contribution, So with that, let me just go ahead and because I'm pretty certain you all have a lot of questions, and if you don't worry, I have more. But I'd rather give you folks the opportunity, more opportunity than less. Is there anyone like to ask anything? Yes.
You've talked about this already, Carolyn. But could you say a little more about the archive of primary sources that you consulted? I'm interested in particular in what there is besides the letters among the four. Are there diaries? Are there accounts of the foursome that are addressed to other audiences and not internally? And how would those differ from the internal correspondence?
Well, the archives are enormous, voluminous. Anyone who has perhaps looked into the O'Keeffe and Stieglitz papers at Yale, at Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, will know that I think no human being can possibly read her way through all of them. But there's a great deal in addition to the correspondence, John. There are personal writings by O'Keeffe and by Rebecca. The problem is we don't have a lot of Paul's writings. This is very interesting, and one could speculate about the reasons. Neither woman saved his letters, neither Rebecca nor Georgia, and we don't know why. So we're...
Would you conjecture?
Well, maybe the fact that they had both been attached to him in one way or another was sufficiently awkward that they didn't want to leave any traces. And also, in Rebecca's case, maybe the fact that she married again after she and Paul divorced meant that she felt she really mustn't hang on to his letters, but he hung on to hers, that's the other source, John. They're in the Center for Creative Photography in Tucson, where all of Strand's things are, including his correspondence. But let's see what else. There are lots of contemporary accounts, wonderful, juicy, funny accounts by people like the inevitable Mabel Dodge Lewin. She pops up everywhere. She knew them all very well.
Talk a little bit more about her. So she ends up becoming the person who brings out D.H. Lawrence to Taos and I think might be the definition of cultural appropriation.
Absolutely.
Talk a little bit about her. She is fascinating.
How many of you know Mabel Dodge Lewin? She keeps turning up in my books, whatever I'm writing, except for Piaf. She never found it.
You never know.
But she had a very complicated and fraught relationship with Mina Loy when they both lived in Florence. Mabel Dodge was an American heiress who liked to create what we might call cultural salons. So, and she had very good taste in where to live. She lived in Florence for quite a time before and during, just up to World War I, where she met Mina and a whole raft of other people who lived there. And she managed to totally mess up their lives by turning one against another and patronizing one and dumping another. And, giving Mina Loy her cast-off dresses and then criticizing her looks and things like that. And Mabel had very good taste and a fair amount of money, and she attracted people to her, so there must have been more to her that meets the eye. Well, she then lived in New York for a time in the Village during World War I, where she and Stieglitz became friends. She was quite an intellectual. She was also being psychoanalyzed then at a time when this was an unusual thing to do, so she could talk with considerable knowledge about Freud and Jung and the relations of art and psychology. She was also, for a time, the mistress of John Reed. I mean, Mabel Dodge gets around. Well, she married several more times and moved with her then husband, a painter, to New Mexico, having decided that, and this was a common sentiment, it was time to look into the true America, the West, get away from the East Coast with all its European models and see what could be done in the deep America, if we can call it that. So Mabel, I'm borrowing from the French idea about the provinces. So Mabel moved to Taos in the late 1910s and founded yet another art colony, to which she lured D.H. Lawrence, who at that time was indeed a great hero and cause célèbre among this group. Stieglitz wrote to D.H. Lawrence. He wanted to publish his work. This is all sort of a larger cultural ferment. And Mabel managed to alienate D.H. Lawrence after a while, but he did get some writing done there, and even based a character on Mabel. So when Georgia and Rebecca decided in 1929 to go west, and in particular to the southwest, which was the destination already amongst in their circle, they very soon met and were befriended by Mabel, who in a certain, I can't help giggling at Mabel, but in a certain way, Mabel must have seen them as fresh recruits. Particularly, Georgia is already well known at that point in 1920, so it's quite a plum if you can attract someone of that caliber. And for a time, Georgia and Rebecca shared a small studio on Mabel's property, where Georgia painted, and from time to time Rebecca did too. But there were many dramas, in particular when Mabel thought that Georgia was getting too close to her then husband, Tony Lujan.
Tony Lujan, who's a Pueblo Indian.
Yeah, Pueblo Indian, yes. And she was quite convinced that Georgia was cozying up to Tony and vice versa, which was probably not the truth. Tony was a very, very, very attractive fellow and very outgoing.
They did, though, seem to prefer him over her.
Yes, they
They
did prefer him.
enjoyed just hanging out with him and driving around and seeing things.
They went camping with him. Yeah.
And the two things, you brought up 1929, and if I'm remembering correctly, I think this is one of the moments in the book that you feel a sense of triumph, because this is when Salisbury and O'Keeffe decide that their marriages, their respective marriages with Strand and Stieglitz, aren't working. And they rely on each other to basically one day say, we're going to get on a train and we're going back to Taos. And we're going to make a life.
That's right. Worked out a bit differently, but it is a turning point. It was a very, very major moment for both women. In time, while Rebecca settled in Taos and did practice her art there and did meet the man she would marry later, Georgia quickly tired of the social life, the very gossipy social life of what was called Mabletown. And and Georgia fortunately found the spot that would inspire her for the rest of her life in the mountains about 40 miles away. Has anyone been to Ghost Ranch? Extraordinary sight. When I got there, I finally understood, I think, why it was that she chose that site and it chose her in a way. So she removed herself and established the conditions that were necessary for her to both live her life independently as she wished, still going back to New York for several months a year to look after Stieglitz and be with him as long as he lived. Mm-hmm. She did not settle in New Mexico permanently until after his death, which is interesting. But that was a complete turning point for both women, although their paths diverged a little, they still remained friends.
And for Salisbury, it's his transformation. To explain that transformation, she becomes this sort of Annie Oakley. But she kind of gets it honestly. Could you talk a little bit about what her father did?
Yes, this is a wonderful part of the book. Rebecca Salisbury thought of herself as some kind of American nobility, almost aristocracy, because her father, Nate Salisbury, is the man who, he claimed, invented the Wild West Buffalo Bill show. The extraordinary traveling phenomenon that was that very successful show that went all over the U.S., throughout Europe, performed for queens and kings and heads of state. It was, in its time, in the 80s, 90s, just the beginning of the last century, probably the most popular cultural phenomenon. It was far more than a circus. It had claims to being a proper representation of the West and how the West was formed. Well, growing up with that kind of family and being taken as a little girl, as she was, to the performances in England for Queen Victoria and others, no doubt you might form an idea that, your family was somewhat special. And this is so amusing. When she was introduced to Alfred Stieglitz, no doubt early on in the conversation, the name of Nate Salisbury came up. And he and his circle looked to her as a kind of American original. This is a woman who knows how to ride a horse. She knew Annie Oakley. She knew Buffalo Bill. You can see the aura at the time in the Stieglitz circle of knowing such a person who seems to be in some way, or presents herself as, a true American. So when she settles in the Southwest and starts wearing Western garb and riding clothes, and she
drinking mucho whiskey, according to her own words.
Yeah, and swearing like the cowboys. She sort of comes by it honestly, but it's also a bit of a caricature.
Any questions? No? That's fine. There's other people besides the foursome. We already talked about Mabel. Another character who enters into the life in which they write about is Gene Toomer.
Oh, he's a fascinating character. Do some of you know the work of Gene Toomer? Yeah. I've got a good photograph of him in the book, and also, I think, one of George's paintings inspired by Gene Toomer. He was a man of mixed race, many races. He claimed, 6 or 7 or 8 different ethnic and, what should we say, we don't say this anymore, but racial origins. very handsome man. Some described him as looking like a well-educated Indian gent. But what he was known for at the time was, first of all, his first book called Cain, which is just getting some attention again after having been forgotten for quite some time, which was a picture of what he called Negro life in the South. Very beautifully written in a recognizably modernist style. So this book and its author, Jean Toomer, were immediately adopted by the Stieglitz Circle as, you know, one of them, somebody who saw, only in his case, he saw the potential for describing parts of America that hadn't really been properly rendered before. He, such a fascinating character, he was on a spiritual surf. He became a follower of Gurdjieff. And because Mabel Dodge was also on this kind of path, she invited Jean Toomer after Lawrence left to come stay down on the farm in Taos. She was always keen to have interesting, stimulating, and good-looking company. So Jean Toomer befriended Mabel, but didn't stay very long because he quickly saw how her need to dominate. But he and Georgia had a very close and interesting relationship, which helped in Georgia's recovery from her nervous breakdown. You may know that she had a nervous breakdown in the early 30s, and for several years was really, really suffering, in large part, I think, because of Alfred's affair with a much younger woman who came to the gallery. But Jean Toomer, had a strong spiritual bent, and I think that many recognized this in him. That's enough, perhaps.
No, that's fine, because the thing that was interesting about that is that they are left alone at Lake George.
Yes.
And she writes about how she could just be near him in silence, that they don't have to talk, they don't have to do anything, just his presence. And it becomes this incredibly charged situation of attraction. And what gets her, though, and this is I think maybe the takeaway, if you will, what gets her out of her funk is that staying within these sort of boundaries in terms of what they should do, despite what they're feeling, gives her inspiration in terms of what to do with what she wants to do next. In other words, where Stieglitz is often in his personal life someone who not only does not toe the line, just crushes it and steps on it over and over again in terms of what he needs, for his inspiration. You see in this moment with Toomer and O'Keeffe, someone who's really operating on a spiritual level, someone who's thinking in terms of, what can I do with this sort of energy? In other words, there's almost something rather almost pure about it.
Yes, that's the way it seems to me, too. She wrote to him after he left Lake George, and she was really recovering her spirit quite well and quickly, that it had meant so much to her to be with him, and that she could now continue. Although they had not become intimates in the obvious sense, they were intimate spiritually. And she acknowledged that both in her letters to him and in her paintings inspired by him. It's a very, very touching experience to read through that correspondence and think about what they were to each other. There's so many different ways we can be with each other. That is rather unusual.
Yes, please.
Is that in 28 that happened roughly, or is that later? Is it prior to her leaving?
No, it's
Because he had an affair which also drove her out. That's his secretary, though.
Yes, that's Dorothy Norman. This comes after. The nervous breakdown is about 31, 32, and her recovery was very slow and gradual. She had the great good fortune to do what people who could in those days did. Take a voyage. She went to Bermuda and spent several months there and did the interesting paintings that we know from that period. But then she came back to Lake George. She wanted to return to life with Stieglitz. And it was, I think, the winter of 32 that Oscar is describing, Stieglitz spent a few days up at the house in Lake George with Toomer and O'Keeffe, and then he had to go back to New York, so that left the two there together, and that's when this,
Right.
yeah.
And at this point, I think, I guess leading up to that nervous breakdown, at this point, Lake George, which should be this idol, has now become, now that she's been in New Mexico, now that she's been, basically has found her place. When she's there, she just describes in these terms of like basically saying, well, it's green, and there are trees. And so I guess, what are you going to do? But she's just completely disenchanted.
Well, she even wrote a marvelous phrase in a letter to a friend, I can't endure the green. She had done it. She had painted everything she could there. And there's some wonderful paintings from Lake George. Maybe some of you saw the exhibition that was at the DeYoung a few years ago, with O'Keeffe at Lake George. Really fine work there. But she had done everything she could with it, and the house held too many memories. She just had to have a new place, new space of her own, chosen by her, not by somebody else, as this is the Stieglitz family home at Lake George. In other words, not her choice.
Yes. Any other questions? Yes, please.
How did you get interested in this subject, and what is your progressive interest? I mean, how did it deepen, and what sources did you use to write the book?
Well, up till now, I have written biographies of unusually talented, artistic, unconventional women. So I wrote 3 biographies of women artists of different sorts. And the last one being Edith Piaf. And when I was sort of resting, having finished the Piaf book and not being sure what to do next, a friend of mine in Santa Cruz, the man I mentioned who became my collaborator, Lance Sprague, who couldn't come this evening, said, I have someone for you. I have another woman. And I said, oh, who is she? He said, Rebecca Salisbury Strand James. I said, oh, because those were all her names, 2 marriages. And I looked into her artwork, the little of it that I could find, and I also found out that there was a vast correspondence both between her and Strand and her and Stieglitz, and then some between her and O'Keeffe. But even reading through what I could at Yale and at the Center for Creative Photography, I saw that I didn't wish to do another book of the sort I had done already, one person's life, as some say, womb to tomb. I wanted something different. And I also saw at the same time that looking at the better known 3 and their circle through Rebecca's eyes allowed me to see the story in a new way, or a different way. She was very, very helpful and encouraging to me, but I came up with the idea that I wanted to do the 2 couples together, the foursome, in all the different kinds of relationships that they had, which of course include the friendships between the 2 women, the rivalry between the 2 men, the cross back and forth of their relations. The sources, as we said, were mostly at Yale, at Beinecke, at CCP, Center for Creative Photography, some in New York in the public library. The Nate Salisbury papers are there. Wonderful to go and read about Nate Salisbury's adventures before he met Buffalo Bill. He had the first Negro acting troupe in the country. He was an interesting character in his own right. He wrote plays, so on. So I went to the various archives, and I also read everything written on these people that I could find to get a sense of the larger context and their issues. And then I interviewed whoever was still around who had known them. I did quite a few interviews.
How long is the process for when you got the idea about Rebecca till the finishing point?
7 years. This is not unusual, but you see, I should say, I didn't know what I was getting into. I should have known it was not just 4 times 1, it was 4 times 4. really, the way the lives cross back and forth. So I didn't realize just how challenging it would be. But at the same time, I was learning something akin to fiction, learning how to weave people's lives, learning how to use what they wrote in their letters almost like dialogue. So I suppose it's not surprising that it took the time it took.
Sorry. Was it common practice for people to hold on to such volumes of correspondence? In your research, it sort of snowballs. These people wrote these, and you realize that, Stieglitz, I think, wrote sometimes 5 letters a day.
That's right,
Yeah,
before
so-
breakfast.
Yeah. And they kept them all. So.
They're just texting.
And that's a reasonable thing to say, but I mean, that becomes boxes and sometimes crates, right?
Yes, and well, the books I've worked on, all 4, that has been the case. People wrote voluminously. Nobody wrote as much as Stieglitz. But perhaps they kept them. They must have been in some way aware of their own significance and importance in the history that was unfolding, that they were participating in and shaping. We won't have documents like that.
Yes.
Coming back to a man who's giving you a nervous breakdown and nursing him to death seems to be risking another nervous breakdown.
I suppose you're right, but as it turned out, the young woman whose affair with Stieglitz probably precipitated O'Keeffe's breakdown had by then become less attached to Stieglitz, although she remained in his life and took care of a great number of things at the gallery and continued to promote his causes. But O'Keeffe and Stieglitz were able to make peace with each other with quite a bit of difficulty, but their affections and their love for each other and their respect for each other, in spite of this affair with the younger woman, were still very solid. She was generous about him even when she spoke about his faults, O'Keeffe, that is. And it's rather remarkable. I know one might think, as you said, that going back to that situation would just cause more grief. But she found her way. But also, I have to say, because she had discovered an escape, she had discovered the place where she could go and be herself in her own way in the Southwest. Probably it wouldn't have worked if she hadn't already carved out her territory there and started making it possible to live there more and more often.
Should we, one more?
One more,
One more.
Am I the one more, or is there someone?
Yeah.
What do you think was the biggest discovery over those 7 years that you found researching these 4 lives?
The biggest of what sort? What do you imagine? Give me a hint.
Oh, just some type of revelation, either about yourself or about these people, about the history of art.
About myself. That'll come next. About these people. Well, certain things about Georgia O'Keeffe, about whom we have so many ideas preformed, so many preconceptions. Since the 70s, many of us have been thinking about her and discussing her in certain ways. It turned out that she was, for example, not in her own account of her life, a feminist. And in fact, she was hostile to those feminists who came out to visit her in the 70s seeking a role model. She turned away Gloria Steinem, go home, I don't want anything to do with you, which was very, very surprising, very, very interesting. And yet, O'Keeffe was a member of the Women's Party, the political party, throughout the 10s, 20s, and 30s. Also, I was very surprised to learn that she probably remained faithful to Stieglitz from the beginning of their love affair to the end of his life. That this was probably the great love of her life, with all the difficulties attached that we know, and with all the temptations, perhaps, to Jean Tuber and others. According to many fairly reliable sources, she was probably not a very sexual being thereafter. This is interesting to note. Some people close to her, a woman who lived with her, a younger woman who was her housekeeper and took care of many other things. Yes, said that this is starting in the late 40s. This surprised me greatly. Just in the period when you might think that she had become bisexual or who knows what, this close friend, and this information was confirmed by others, said no, she was not a very sexual person. She didn't care so much about relationships. What she cared about was her art, and she found the sensual dimension in her painting and in the landscapes that she loved, where she would camp all night to paint in a certain light, that she was sort of finished with relationships. So I was quite surprised by that. I was sort of prepared to believe the commonly held notions about her that came up for all sorts of good reasons in past decades. But no, I think that she's a rather different person than we knew until we got all those letters. The first volume of their correspondence was published, which was very, very, very revealing and has caused quite a few factual misinterpretations to be corrected.
All right, well,
Interesting.
Carolyn Burke, thank you so much. It's a lovely book, and I should just to note that the narrative also plays out such that there's a lot of tristesse, there's a lot of sorrow towards the end. For all of them, they are all fully human, they're fully realized, and I think that's an incredible, wonderful thing. So
Thank you, Oscar.
Oh, you're most welcome.
Oh, it's very kind of you. And thank you, everyone. Woo.